Watch right now on the Front News project. NATO is ready to destroy Kaliningrad. A war between the Alliance and Russia is just around the corner. Reservists are ready to face local assaults by the armed forces of Ukraine. Putin and his military commanders have a new tactic. And Russia is also running out of tanks. The so-called second army in the world is now left without armored vehicles. Fiery, intense, and blazing footage from the front lines. Watch it right now.
Greetings, this is Sergei Malnev with you, and we're starting right away with the main topic. Kaliningrad and Sevastopol will be destroyed in the very first hours of Russian army aggression against the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance. This was stated by former commander of US forces in Europe, Ben Hodges. Right now, we'll tell you about the development of this scenario that is devastating for the Kremlin.
Kaliningrad and Sevastopol will be destroyed in the first hours if Russia attacks NATO. This statement was made by former commander of US Army forces in Europe, Ben Hodges.
If Russia were to attack Poland in 2025 the same way it attacked Ukraine, it would be destroyed by NATO air forces and the alliance's ground troops. You can be sure that Kaliningrad would be eliminated in the very first hours. In the first hours, Kaliningrad would be gone. All Russian facilities would be destroyed. Any Russian military facilities in Sevastopol as well.
The general is confident that the alliance's response to an attack now would be immediate and devastating. But in 2014, the alliance missed something important. NATO countries allowed Russia to go unpunished for its aggression.
If we go back to 2014, when the war began, Europe, the US and Canada generally supported Ukraine. But many countries were still too dependent on Russia for oil and gas supplies. People would say, come on, don't exaggerate, Russia is an important country, it has nuclear weapons. And back then, in 2014, we failed to make it clear that Russian aggression would not go unpunished. Even the Minsk agreements turned out to be a farce. No sanctions changed Russia's behavior. It had no respect for these measures at all.
Moreover, Russia's behavior became even more aggressive. For example, Russian propagandists personally turned Kaliningrad into a staging ground for military threats against Europe. One such person was the Russian propagandist and State Duma deputy Yevgeny Popov. This summer, he released a report. The report from the missile ship Buria was filled with veiled threats to EU countries. He said, in effect, look, we have Caliber missiles and they can fly over 2,000 kilometers. You can do the math yourself to see where they can reach.
Considering that we're in the Baltic and the range of the Caliber missiles is roughly plus or minus 2,500 kilometers, it's easy to calculate the potential strike zone.
It's against this backdrop that Hodges' words about destroying Kaliningrad were spoken. So the first hours after an attack would not be surprising at all.
The complete destruction of Russian military bases, specifically those located in Sevastopol and in Kaliningrad, which was formerly known as Königsberg, is, in my considered opinion, a perfectly adequate and entirely appropriate response to any potential and significant threat emanating from the Russian Federation.
Hodges' warning is not a hypothetical assumption. NATO has long been preparing for possible aggression specifically from Kaliningrad. At the end of September, for example, Poland and Sweden practiced the defense of Gotland Island, a key element of security in the Baltic region, which is only 300 kilometers from Kaliningrad. These military exercises were intended to send a clear signal of readiness for joint defense in the Baltic Sea. Warning signals are being sent by both Russia and the current high-ranking NATO command. The commander of the US Army in Europe and Africa, General Christopher Donahue, also stated that the alliance would be able to wipe out the Kaliningrad region in an extremely short time if necessary, and added that they have already planned everything.
Back in August, General Donahue said the following about Kaliningrad, that if anything happens, if anyone is thinking about hybrid provocations on the eastern flank, the alliance has operational plans ready that would allow NATO forces in Europe to literally turn Kaliningrad into ashes within a few hours. But of course, Russian propaganda immediately went up in arms. The narrative will start with claims that this is a provocation, a direct threat, and so on. But this statement from an active American general, especially one who holds a position in NATO's military command, is a very direct and clear signal to the bunker and the swamps that everyone sees what you are doing and everyone sees what you are preparing for. And don't think that you are the only ones preparing.
But it's worth noting here that the destruction of cities is probably somewhat of an exaggeration. It's doubtful that NATO would go as far as to incinerate cities. And besides, it's just difficult to do. But as for military targets being ordered to cease to exist?
Well, that is an undeniable and absolute fact indeed, Mo. First of all, the terrain is quite complex. Secondly, you need more than a dozen especially powerful bombs, including even tactical nuclear warheads. But the precise elimination of docks, specific warehouses, quay walls, and the military ships stationed there is a completely feasible task.
In fact, there will be plenty of targets for Tomahawks to hit. There are especially many military targets along the Baltic Sea coast. Here, both aviation and communications troops, as well as repair plants, are concentrated. And Russia should really consider the consequences. But is that really the Kremlin style?
And now, let's analyze the operational situation on the blazing Pokrovsk direction of the front. The Russian world continues here as well to destroy, kill, and maim. In the Pokrovsk direction, since the beginning of the day, the occupiers have carried out 31 attacks on the positions of our defenders in the areas of the settlements of Vladimirovka, Nikanorovka, Mirolyubovka, Novoekonomichnaya, Promin, Lisovka, Pokrovsk, Zverevo, Chunishino, Udakhnaya, Kotlyarovka, Orekhovaya, and Filia. Holding back the enemy onslaught, Ukrainian defenders have already repelled 26 attacks. Dozens of pieces of equipment and hundreds of soldiers. For the second time in a few days, the Russians launched a mechanized assault in the Dobropolye area. In addition, the occupiers are trying to recapture the village of Vladimirovka from our forces. However, Russian military equipment is burning and their infantry is being killed. Ukrainian rocket forces are doing everything they can to repel these attacks. An MLRS system firing long-range rockets once again helped stop the Russian advance. How it happened will be told and shown by TSN special correspondent Yulia Kirienko.
This missile is flying toward a column of Russian equipment heading to storm the outskirts of Dobropilya. 6 tanks, several dozen armored vehicles, and hundreds of Russian infantry on motorcycles tried to break through to the village of Vladimirovka to cut off our troops and unblock their own. This is the longest-range MLRS, multiple launch rocket system, an American MLRS. It is from these launchers that our troops fire ATACMS missiles, and now they're about to go into action. Though not with them, but with another type of missile, but still against the enemy in the Dobropilya direction. The operator is preparing to fire again. The morning is very intense, say the rocket troops. Such an assault from the enemy on this section of the front, there hasn't been anything like this for several months in a row. Shots from long-range artillery can be heard from every tree line. There are 2 people operating this MLRS. While one controls the tracked vehicle, the other enters the firing data into the tablet. Another missile flies toward the convoy and actually stops it. The rocket troops fire so confidently from the MLRS because they are the very first crew of this vehicle since it was delivered to Ukraine by international partners. Back at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the soldiers were working with the Smerch system. And in 2022, even when they went abroad for training, they couldn't quite believe they would be switching to the MLRS.
We actually learned everything in just 3 weeks. We arrived and started working with these systems on the 3rd day.
They actually sent...
As for training, we completed the course. Well, at first, of course, no one believed that they would actually deliver them to Ukraine, but then, to our surprise, we did get them and immediately got to work.
This rocket system is just like the HIMARS, except that one is wheeled, while the MLRS is on a Bradley tracked platform, so it's not afraid of mud or the fields of the Donetsk region at all. It moves quickly between tree lines to choose the best firing position. With it, the rocket crews destroyed more than one enemy shelter, especially after they received long-range ATACMS missiles a year later, in 2023.
There were artillery pieces, command posts, UAV control points, infantry dugouts, and buildings. Every target there was, every possible one.
With the ATACMS, of course, they could reach even farther, deep into the rear of the occupied territories.
It was about a year ago with those ATACMS, about a year ago. 300 kilometers by 500, those were the ones they gave us. With them, you can hit targets in the rear, including command posts.
At that time, the missile force's soldiers significantly decapitated the enemy's army. Now they are covering our assault troops during the Dobropilia operation. They say they're not sparing the missiles and have reserves, although they've repeatedly felt how political circumstances on the international stage affect supplies.
They come in waves, sometimes things don't work out for them at the top. There were delays, but then everything was sorted out. Now everything is running smoothly, they've delivered supplies, and for now we have what we need to work.
So the launcher is once again heading out into the fields of Donetsk region, preparing another missile for launch. The enemy took advantage of the bad weather and, under the cover of fog, moved in with vehicles to launch an assault. But this fog also works in favor of the rocket crews because it hides the MLRS from Russian reconnaissance drones, for which such a system is a prime target. To destroy it, the occupiers don't even spare Iskanders. But despite the fog, vigilance is still necessary. That's why the MLRS crew changes position after every shot. And while they're heading to a new position, the vehicle commander receives a message from headquarters. The Russian columns have been completely stopped. Now it's up to the FPV drone operators, who are finishing off enemy equipment on the battlefield. They burn it out to finally halt the Russian assault.
And now we move to the Alexandrovsk direction of the front. The enemy is raging here as well. In the Alexandrovsk direction, the invaders tried 17 times to break through to Ukrainian positions near the settlements of Zeleny High, Ivanivka, Oleksandrograd, Sekhneva, Sosnivka, Alexeyevka, Novonikolаевka, Novogrihorivka, Malinivka, and Poltavka. 5 clashes are still ongoing. And here is another extremely important topic. Russian reservists will soon be sent to the front. The government of the aggressor country has approved this initiative from the Ministry of Defense. Putin's army is in dire straits when it comes to manpower, and now those Russians who hoped to quietly sit out the war on their couches will be forcibly sent into meat grinder assaults. More on the reasons for and consequences of this Kremlin decision for the situation at the front, coming up next.
About 2 million Russians, that's how many more the Kremlin can now, and sent to fight in the war in Ukraine. The Russian Ministry of Defense has come up with a way to launch mobilization essentially just by renaming it. This concerns a new bill that has been supported by a government commission. This is a document that allows the use of reservists in peacetime.
The Defense Ministry's bill, which sets the conditions for involving reservists in tasks during peacetime, is aimed at expanding the range of uses for this category of personnel. The point of the amendments is to broaden the scope of application for this category of personnel. That's all there is to it. Andrei Kartapolov, head of the State Duma Defense Committee.
State Duma Representative Andrei Kartapolov, who is known for his repeated radical statements regarding the so-called special military operation, explained that the authorities have specified the conditions for the use of reservists. These are people who previously served voluntarily in the Russian army, received payments and benefits for it, and now are in the reserve. In reality, however, Russia is simply suffering enormous losses at the front. The number of new contract soldiers is decreasing, but losses still need to be replenished.
We see that the authorities are avoiding a second wave of mobilization, so they need a different procedure that will allow them to use the mobilization resource. Artem Klyga, human rights activist.
The draft law allows reservists to be sent to war in Ukraine during peacetime under the guise of so-called special training camps.
Special training camps are a new type of military assembly that the authors of the bill propose to include in the law on military duty and military service, specifically in Article 54, military assemblies. Currently, it lists 2 categories of military assemblies: training assemblies and inspection assemblies. They propose to add a 3rd category to these, special assemblies. As stated in the law, special assemblies are military assemblies for carrying out specific tasks in the field of defense during armed conflicts, during counterterrorism operations, as well as when deploying the military outside the country. Only reservists will undergo them. The procedure for conducting special assemblies will be determined by the president. Their duration cannot exceed 2 months.
Perhaps this scheme is for those who have not been ready to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense until now, but who are willing to fight for a couple of months. Maybe so. The Kremlin is hedging its bets in case there is a severe shortage. But after the amendments to the law on military service are signed, those who refuse to go to war in Ukraine could easily end up behind bars. There are plenty of vacant spots there.
The current Russian legislation, which criminalizes normal political life, is such that today anyone can be thrown in prison. And if anyone can be thrown in prison, then the camps were emptied after a huge number of people were sent to the front where they were killed, so they can be filled up again. Here's another reserve. That's why I think Putin will make a decision based on tactical considerations at the very last moment, when it becomes necessary, when they urgently need to send another 50,000 or 30,000 people to the front.
The reserve of the Russian army consists of Russians who have voluntarily signed a contract. The decree on the creation of this reserve was signed by Putin in 2015. Reservists undergo military training every year. Usually the mobilization reserve consists of former contract soldiers. There are about 2 million such people in the territory of the Russian Federation. And in the near future, these Russians may be used in the war in Ukraine without declaring martial law or announcing a second wave of mobilization in Russia.
And now let's analyze the situation on the Constantinovka front. The bloody rampage of the enemy army continues here as well. On the Constantinovka direction, the Russian occupiers attacked the positions of our defenders 19 times in the areas of the settlements of Pleshchevka, Shcherbinovka, Klebanbik, Oleksandro Kalinove, and Rusin Yar. Ukrainian units repelled 15 attacks. 3 more combat clashes are still ongoing. The Russian army is facing an unprecedented shortage of tanks. During the period of the Great War, the Kremlin lost 20,000 of these combat vehicles. About the causes and consequences of the tank crisis faced by the occupiers. Coming up next.
Pilots from the 3rd Assault using 2 drones destroy a Russian tank that was hidden in a forest plantation. One of the drones flies right into the barrel. Videos like this showing the destruction of a tank have become quite rare over the past year, since the Ukrainian armed forces have knocked out a huge amount of the occupiers' equipment. The Russian army is essentially forced to carry out assaults on foot or on motorcycles.
They're running out of infantry fighting vehicles and tanks. So they have to put infantry simply on motorcycles and on unarmored civilian vehicles.
Since the start of the full-scale invasion, over 11,000 Russian tanks have been destroyed in Ukraine. These are figures from the General Staff of the Ukrainian Command. The Russian armed forces now have only a third of the tanks in reserve that they had before the invasion of Ukraine began.
After 3 years of war, Moscow has depleted its tank reserves to such an extent that, according to reports, they are almost exhausted. Although the Kremlin insists there are no problems replenishing tanks. Notably, in 2022, Russia's tank reserves were stored at 24 bases across the country. And today only 9 such facilities remain in operation. Peter Sutsiu, military analyst.
Russia has significantly slowed the use of Soviet-era tanks on the front line as the gray zone is filled with Ukrainian UAVs for which tanks are easy prey. Data on the loss of a large portion of tanks in the war with Ukraine since December 2022 is also confirmed by the American Institute for the Study of War.
Russia still has 46% of its pre-war stock of tanks, 42% of its pre-war stock of infantry fighting vehicles, and 48% of its pre-war stock of armored personnel carriers. Images of 8 Russian military depots apparently show that Russia has depleted most of its vehicle stockpile warehouses. A social media source estimated that Russia will likely exhaust its remaining stockpiles of tanks and armored vehicles by the end of 2025. Russia may have additional armored vehicles and tanks in covered storage that are not visible in satellite images.
The Russian Federation is now facing a dilemma. The stockpiles of Soviet-era armored vehicles are almost completely depleted. About 60% of the Soviet-era armored vehicles that were in long-term storage depots have already been lost. On the territory of the Russian Federation, they have been effectively destroyed by Ukrainian defense forces.
Over more than 3 years of war, the Kremlin has withdrawn most of its tanks from storage. These vehicles went from storage to depots and then to the front lines where they were destroyed, captured, or abandoned. The resources and efforts spent on restoring these vehicles did not pay off and did not deliver the desired results on the battlefield. Now, there simply isn't the necessary amount of equipment anymore.
According to the latest intelligence data from open sources, as of today, Russia has only 2,887 tanks in storage, and more than half of them are in poor condition. Less than a quarter of them could be classified as suitable for use on the battlefield. Fewer than 100 T-80 tanks were considered relatively modern, while the rest included outdated T-62, T-64, and T-72 tanks. Of earlier models,
the Russian Federation is capable of reviving between 1,200 and 1,400 units of Soviet armored vehicles, but not of producing new ones. According to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the production of new tanks by the Russian Federation amounts to about 180 to 200 units, and taking into account the number of armored vehicles being destroyed. On the line of combat contact with the Ukrainian Defense Forces, this is a drop in the ocean.
Taking into account figures from various sources, the question now is not whether decommissioned Russian tanks will appear on the battlefield, but when this might happen and whether it is even possible in the necessary quantities.
Now let's move to the Lyman and Sloviansk directions of the front. Let's be honest, these are sacred targets for Putin and his entourage. Accordingly, the situation here is also extremely tense. In the Lyman direction, Ukrainian units repelled 6 attacks in the areas of Rekivka, Kolodyazi, Novoselivka, and Derilova. 2 attacks are still ongoing. In the Sloviansk direction, Ukrainian soldiers repelled 5 enemy attacks. Occupying units are trying to advance in the areas of the settlements of Serebryanka, Yampil, Dronivka, Viemka, and Fedorivka. 2 combat clashes are still ongoing. For the first time, Ukraine's defense forces have showcased the middle strike drone, which strikes enemy targets and equipment both in Crimea and along the front line. And here is the Bulava, Ukraine's answer to the Russian Lancet, which destroyed quite a bit of Ukrainian equipment at the start of the full-scale war. Now it's our turn, say Ukrainian defenders, as many drones have already been delivered to the front line. Special TCH correspondent Yulia Kirienko will tell you more. Watch her exclusive report.
We're interested in any kind of equipment, maybe some forces, air defense assets.
And to find this equipment, Dmytro will be helped by the Middle Strike drone, a new product of Ukrainian manufacture. The Leleka UAV plant has long been supplying such drones to the Ukrainian army. But this particular reconnaissance drone is a modified version which can now fly hundreds of kilometers from the line of contact. Since the Russians transferred significant reinforcements to the Pokrovsk direction, there have been battles both in the sky and on the ground here, the military say. The occupiers are trying to capture Pokrovsk at any cost, so while they are amassing equipment, Dmytro and his team's task is to find it as quickly as possible.
Right now, we're gaining altitude to see if we can operate or not. We've already been given the target. We're taking off now. If it doesn't leave, then we'll destroy it. If it does leave, then we'll look for something else. An anti-aircraft missile system.
While the UAV rises above the clouds to spot enemy armor, the soldiers take something out of a box that looks like a construction set. This is a medium-range loitering munition. Exactly what you need not only to find enemy equipment, but to destroy it as well. This is probably the coolest thing I've seen at the front. It's a loitering munition that flies far beyond the line of contact, deep into Russian rear positions. It looks like a Lancet, but it's a Ukrainian-made counterpart. By the way, it's funded by foreign partners. This is the Bulava. The defense forces are showing it to journalists for the first time. Last year, it was only presented at closed defense industry exhibitions. And for several months now, it has finally made it to the front. A significant order for our military was paid for by partners from a northern European country to Ukrainian manufacturers. In 2023, soldiers could only dream of a kamikaze drone capable of burning through Russian armor appearing in the army.
Now, such munitions are striking targets even in Crimea. That is, we are now using them on our own tactical battlefield. But I know of cases when our Ukrainian loitering munitions, Bulava, Ram, X, flew into Crimea and destroyed helicopters there.
But the task of this drone now is to weaken the enemy near Pokrovsk. Such complexes as Leleka and Bulava are already operating in several units of the unmanned systems forces.
There were 5 sorties, 5 hits.
Just 2 years ago, Russia had the advantage in this type of drone. Their Lancets burned up more than 1 gun or tank in the Ukrainian army, and there was no escape from them. After all the defense forces could counter the occupiers with were FPV drones, which destroyed equipment as it was approaching our positions. Now, thanks to Bulava and similar systems from the middle strike line, the Russians are forced to hide their guns far behind the front lines.
That wasn't the case before. Before, only nearby positions were covered. For example, FPV drones and similar things were used. Now we can cover a greater distance. This is an American camel munition, meaning it burns through armor and equipment.
Exactly what we need for the target that Leleka found. Now the main thing is to properly calibrate the munition. Carefully carry the drone to the catapult and launch the disposable into the sky. The Bulava rises into the sky. A kamikaze drone worth $30,000 irreversibly flies beyond the horizon. While the pilots were preparing the drone, enemy scouts realized they were being hunted and the armored vehicle drove away. The pilots are urgently searching for another target because they simply can't afford to launch such an expensive kamikaze into the ground.
We're now in free flight, so we'll look for targets ourselves.
They managed to do this fairly quickly. The reconnaissance drone is transmitting a clear image to the pilots. And in the tree line, they spotted a military vehicle. They hope it's carrying ammunition.
We're going in for the strike.
Target destroyed. It turned out to be a truck with provisions. That's not bad either, say the pilots. Russian infantry has long had problems with food and water in the trenches. Because in this phase of the war, the advantage goes to those who can supply their infantry without interruption. The task of the drones in the defense forces is to prevent the enemy from doing that. Otherwise, their infantry will either surrender on their own or remain in the fields of Donbass.
That's all for today, but very soon on Front News there will be new unique reports from our journalists brought to you from the hottest spots of the war so that you know the truth. This was Sergei Malnev with you. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.